G'day folks, and welcome to this first impressions video of Illusions of Glory. This is part of the Paths of Glory series that started with Ted Race's Paths of Glory. This is designed by Perry Silverman, published by GMT Games in 2017. First published, I should say, in 2017. I will point out critically, there is a living rulebook available on the GMT Games website, and I highly recommend you get a copy of those living rules for reasons which I'll go into. I have two key things to say in this video. The first is that this is a great game using the living rules. It is a wonderful successor to Paths of Glory. There is an incredible amount of tension, nail-biting moments throughout the game. The card-driven game system works really well. There is a lot of back and forth. It tells a really good story of the Eastern Front. And I mean, this is a situation at the end of our first game, our first attempt of Illusions of Glory. And it pretty closely follows the historical course of events. I like games that kind of allow you to, branch from history, but we found that it was pretty close, relatively speaking. So look, fantastic game. I really enjoyed it. Played with a friend yesterday, and he was really frustrated by some aspects, which I'll talk about. But I think there's a great game design here and some real fascinating game design decisions. I found it a really enjoyable experience and one that I want to return to. So I finished my first game thinking, I really want to play this again and again and again and just explore possibilities. Now I'm a veteran of Paths of Glory. I've played well over 100 games of Paths of Glory, probably close to 150, 200. I've probably played about 20 to 30 games of Pursuit of Glory. So I'm not quite as experienced. And as I said, first game here. So that's the first thing I want to say. It is a good game using the living rules. The second thing I want to say is that this is one of the worst poorly polished GMT publications I've ever seen. Coming in 2017, where GMT Games are kind of at their were setting the gold standard for game design quality and component quality. This was really shocking in how poorly finished it was. Now, I don't want to blame anyone. I don't know where that happens. I've read many things about how it happened. Perry has said on some of the forums he sent his art to GMT and it was modified. There were printing errors. Look, little things from inconsistent counter size. Let me try and see if I can find an example here. But sometimes, look, here we go. This is no. There are sometimes 1 to 2 millimeter differences in the size of these counters. These should be identically sized counters. That's actually pretty close. But some of these vary by 1 to 2 millimeters in the printing and cutting. We also have, so there are numerous counter errors. There we have duplicate Turkish units we found. So here we have the 24th core, and here we have the 24th core, for example. Am I missing something here? Are they not meant to be the 24th core? 2 identical units. We're missing units. We're missing a lot of administrative counters. And again, this is the first edition. My understanding is that a lot of these have been fixed up, but just shocking. The cards will say, place this counter here as a reminder. And we spend, you can see over here, this is our Serbian collapse marker because we don't have a Serbian collapse marker. We just had to create our own counter. A lot of that happening, not just once or twice, but wow. Numerous times throughout the game, a card would direct us to place a counter that doesn't exist, or place a unit that doesn't exist, or there are units that have been printed and we can find no way to bring them onto the board. So look, that's part of it, components, but also the rule book. The original rulebook has changed radically. The rules changed radically between the original rulebook from 2017 and the living rules, to the extent that it is a very different game. The living rules, so I learned the game using the rules as published, and then I realized they were living rules, so I printed them off just to see what had changed, and it's a very, very different game. A lot changes between the two games, largely around permanent elimination of units and what can cause units to be permanently eliminated. The original rules were quite harsh. The living rules wind this back a bit. The strategic redeployment of units, when I initially read the rules, I was like, wow, this is quite a change. And then they wound a lot of those rules back for the living rules. But also minor nations, Bulgaria, Albania, Greece, the rules around a lot of these minor nations change radically between the original rules and the living rules, to the point that the original rules in the box are useless. It's actually a detriment to learning the game. You throw those away and print off the living rules straight away. So look, that's my second message. There's a fascinating game here, but if you've got a first edition copy, wow, you've got a journey ahead of you. We really struggled to reconcile inconsistencies between the cards as printed and the living rules. So a card will say do X, Y, Z, but the rules don't let us do X, Y, Z. And we found that on many occasions. We were trying to reconcile. Okay, for example, one card, an Italian reinforcement card said bring Italian reinforcements into an Italian home supply source in the Italian front box. Now, there are 4 Italian reinforcements to bring in, and there's only 1 Italian home supply source, and then the stacking limit is 3. So if you've got 4 units to bring in to one space, and it doesn't specify Verona, it says Italian home supply sources. I don't know why it says that. Why doesn't it just say Verona? Because there's only 1. I mean, what then do you do with the extra unit? We home ruled it that they could also come into southern Italy. Now, maybe this is meant to be part of the Italian front. Later, another event allowed the Austro-Hungarians to bring in some reinforcements. They didn't have the space. I put the extra unit in the replaceable units box that could be rebuilt. So we kind of were house ruling a couple of little things that were unclear. But yeah, a lot of little things like that. The card will say do X, Y, Z, but the living rules are saying otherwise. Stuff like rules around Albania were very quirky. Albania plays a relatively minor role, but we found a lot of inconsistencies here. Greece was confusing. The Russian Revolution is the other thing. So the event cards around, and I'll try and find it for you to demonstrate. Here's Russian food rights. So the living rules say that there are 2 ways the Russian Revolution can happen. Either Russian food riots or uprising. And it says either uprising or Russian food riots has to be a prerequisite for the Russian Revolution to happen. But the event card says it can't be played until Russian food riots has been played and an uprising unit is present. Now, that's inconsistent with the rules. Now, does the card take precedent or do the living rules take precedent? Normally, in these kind of games, the card would take precedence, but then there's the living rules, and we weren't sure what to do. Now, I strongly suspect that the living rules were meant to supersede some of the card text, but I couldn't find that stated explicitly. And what I think I'm going to do is create some adhesive labels to apply to some of these event cards, to a lot of these event cards, to try and fix them up to correct them in light of the living rules. The reason I'm going to go to that effort is because, as I said, first point, this is a fascinating game. I think it's a fantastic design. It's fun to play. So let me get to that core point. I've made my criticism. Atrocious production from GMT. And as I said, I hope you've heard me praise GMT for the standard they've set over the past decade or two, in the quality of design, in component quality, etc. But this is a really huge exception. It is, as I said, terrible quality and finalization of those rules. Okay, so that said, once you kind of sort through, once you realize you have to get a pen out and create your own counters for certain events, and that there are many counters missing, and you kind of have to house rule your way through some edge cases, once you acknowledge that and are prepared to work through it, I love the game. I think it's a very great successor to Paths of Glory. I will say I like this more than Pursuit of Glory. There is less chrome than Pursuit of Glory. It sits between the two, between the simplicity of Paths of Glory and the complexity of Pursuit of Glory. But there's still kind of elements of chrome, and it still retains quite a lot of historical flavour. And in fact, I'd go so far as to argue that this feels, my first play, it feels the most historically accurate of all three titles, which is really quite amazing. Given the production issues, etc., the rules issues, this feels like it retains more of the historical flow of events of those three titles: Illusions, Paths, and Pursuit. Tension everywhere. I want to talk about some defining characteristics of gameplay. So in both Paths and Pursuit of Glory, there is a lot of manoeuvre. Yes, you have the Western Front bogged down, but over in the Near East and on the Eastern Front, there's a lot of manoeuvre. The Russians can lose Grodno and Kovno, and it's okay. Things move and they lose Warsaw, etc. Same in Pursuit of Glory. There's a lot of manoeuvre. You've got some fast-moving units, etc. Our first game experience of Illusions of Glory, was that we were fighting tooth and nail over every location. Every single space was a bitter battle. Huge piles. You can see big piles of casualties here. We were using a lot of replacements and struggling to keep up because there was such intense fighting. We were burning through events, so we were playing the events. We got our first game ended by getting the combined war. You can't see it; it's just off the top. By getting our combined war status to the armistice marker. Now, the armistice marker will move down as nations begin to collapse, and your war status moves up when you play key events. So we were playing a lot of events for the events, and these trigger your war status. Let me try and show you an example. Falkenhayn, for example, when you play him in his event, you gain 1 war status. And you want to play these events to get your war status, get you to total war, etc. So we were certainly playing events, but intense fighting. And as I said, I would argue that trenches play an immensely valuable role. They are more valuable in Illusions of Glory than Paths or Pursuit of Glory, because a lot of the VP locations for the Russians are along the front here. They're in sort of Poland, Belarusian territory here. You've got Warsaw, Lomza, Brest-Litovsk, Ivangorod. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 Russian VP spaces within 1 or 2 spaces of the frontier. And because you've also got German supply sources very close, German and Austrian supply sources very close to the front. So when the Germans are rebuilding units, they are literally 1 move away from the front lines. When the Russians are rebuilding units, they are also 1 move away from the front, or in fact, on the front. This means that there is relative to Paths of Glory and Pursuit of Glory, there is less wasteful movement. Generally, when you are activating a stack for movement, they are moving to the front and to a place they can attack. So those who've played Paths of Glory and Pursuit of Glory, you'll often spend 2, sometimes 3 turns setting your forces up for an attack. You want to minimize wasteful movement. That's a key strategy. But because of the distances between supply sources and the front, you often have to spend those 2 or 3 turns preparing, moving, not much happening. Not the case in Illusions of Glory. You are building reinforcements or building replacements, and they may be on the front in Brest-Litovsk or Thorn or Krakow, for example, or they're 1 turn away from the front, which means that they're in the thick of the fighting much sooner, and because of that, they're engaged more quicker, and because of that, there's more fighting going on. So there is constant back and forth for those frontier forts and VP locations, and it creates this incredible tension. You're often looking for sort of 2-to-1. So you can see in Brest-Litovsk, the Russians recaptured Brest-Litovsk. The Germans held it for a little bit, but you can see how this nexus of railroads. You've got one coming from the north, one from the east, one from the south, and one from the west. And 2 are held by the Germans, 2 are held by the Soviets. So there's like 2-on-1. Germans capture it. 2-on-1. The Russians recapture it, and it's this it's a hard place to hold once the fort is destroyed, and then it becomes this back and forth. Similar story with Grodno as well. So Grodno, further up in the north here, a road from the west, a road to the north, road to the east, road to the south, 2 held by the Germans, 2 held by the Russians, and it becomes this focus for fighting. There are many situations like that throughout the map. I also want to point out Chernovitz here. So this is remarkably held by the Austrians in our game, principally because of this water barricade, a water obstacle, which lets the Austrians fire first on the defence. And they held this throughout the game. They never lost control of Chernovitz, which is really quite remarkable. The Russians outflanked it at one stage, and because they were attacking from the south, they ignored the water and they rolled poorly on that attack, and it became a focus for the Austrians to retake Sereth down here. So look, yes, the key, I'm kind of diving into examples, but my key point here is really intense back and forth fighting over 1, 2, or 3 key locations. And we didn't see a stalemate. It was never static. There were always spaces being captured and recaptured, largely because there are some really powerful combat cards. I'm just going to look at the top of my limited war deck here. When a German large combat unit is attacking, the allied player must reduce a Russian large combat unit. A lot of -1 dice roll modifier cards. Where's my other? I think it must be my Total War deck. Some really great. There are a number of combat cards that let you ignore trenches, and the Russians in particular were using that to great effect. Here's another great one. Fürwals. If the Central Powers attack includes a large combat unit, they roll for attack first, inflict losses before the Russians can counter. So that's a really powerful combat card. There was another one. All trench effects are cancelled. Trench effects include, of course, the column shifts, but also cancelling retreat. So the Russians would not be able to cancel the retreat should that card be used. Another +1. So some really powerful combat cards that, when used at the right time, can be really critical in just capturing those key locations. I'm focusing on the kind of the north, that sort of Polish area up there, but it's the same story elsewhere throughout the board. Fort Repel, for example, was captured relatively early through the event card, but they never made it down to Salonika. We had a lot of early Austrian success. They focused on kind of pushing Serbia and Montenegro out of the Balkans, pushing down onto the border with Greece. We didn't want to invade Greece. Could have done so, thought about it a lot. Captured Albania when Italy entered the war. But once Serbia was pushed down to here, this was a pretty static area. You can see some vacant spaces here. What I'm worried about here is possible sea invasion through here. That's why there's Austrians hanging around this area, but pretty static. Romania was a bit of a different story. You can still see some Romanian units here in northern Romania. Their 2 VP locations are held. Bulgarians with both German, Austrian, and Ottoman support. were pushing through Romania. They're really struggling. Yeah, historical. Romania was smashed. What else? Look, the Italian front, I've just made a mess of it, but it was a bloodbath. Heavy losses on both sides with relatively little ground being made. Basically, when you're attacking, I'll clear this so you can see the terrain. When you're attacking into these mountain spaces, the mountains themselves provide a column shift, but you're also attacking by these brown lines, which are roads, which inflict a -1 dice roll modifier on the attacker. And then typically the Austrians and the Italians have a lot of these, as an Italian unit, they have these mounted troops, which provide a +1 dice roll modifier, +1 dice roll modifier when attacking or defending in a mountain space. All right, so there's all these kind of benefits to helping principally the defender, sometimes the attacker. And again, because Austrian units are built here, 1, 2, 3, one movement, and they're in Trent on the front lines pretty much. It's the same if I can just move everything over the way here. Trieste and Carniola. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, they're on the front. So units are lost, they suffer casualties, they rebuild, and they're on the front line, if not immediately, then one turn away. And again, some valuable forts here, Gorizia and so forth. So yeah, we found that basically that story reflecting throughout the entire theatre, this tense, slow, grinding war of attrition. And it really did feel attritional towards the end of the game. And we were playing our replacements, and there was one very important turn right towards the end of the game. If you're wondering, if you can see this pile over here and you're wondering why there are so many permanently eliminated Russians, right towards the end, I think it was like the second or third final turn, the Russians played 2 replacement cards in one turn, and then the Central Powers played Russian Railroad Collapse. RP cannot be spent to repair or rebuild Russian units this turn. So the Russian replacement marker at 0 until the end of this turn. That crippled the Russians. It came at just the right time. They built up all these Russian replacements, and then suddenly it's set to 0. Germans rebuilt. There were no Russian replacements that turn. The next turn, the Germans were hammering at the Russians and permanently eliminating their units because they didn't have the small combat units to replace them. So some of the events were critical. I want to point out one other event. So the Germans reached limited war one turn before the Allied player, and in their very first hand, they drew Russian war material shortage. Any Allied attack or defense that includes a Russian large combat unit must use the light fire table until Polivanov is used. This is an Allied limited war event. They did not draw that for another 4 turns. So they had to reach limited war first, and it took them about 3 card draws before they drew this card, which meant that for about 4 turns, all Central Powers attacks on Russian units meant that the Russians had to use the light fire table. This is basically the weaker table using small combat units. And you can see, even at the best odds, they're nowhere near inflicting the damage that the Central Powers are on their heavy fire table. So that was really critical as well. And the Allied player was very frustrated at that coming out so early and not being able to respond to it. Very, very, very powerful event. So look, what else? Attrition, a lot of really great historical flavour through the events. We found that there was some confusing elements. I mentioned the Russian Revolution. Look, to be honest, I could not resolve it. I could not solve the confusion and the uncertainty. And reading and rereading through the living rules and the cards, I just decided, okay, I'm going to ignore the Russian Revolution and try and capture VPs instead in the standard way. So yes, basically the rules were so unclear with how they related to the events on cards that I just said, okay, well, I'm going to ignore it. So I ignored a whole section of the rules. I ignored the Russian Revolution because I didn't understand it. I could not understand how to get the revolution to happen, which is really frustrating. Greece was pretty confusing as well. There are so many options for Greece. Basically, there's like, all right, if the Central Powers attack Greece, this happens. If the Allies attack Greece, this happens. If the Allies grab Salonika, this happens. What else? Other stuff can happen in the meantime. It shouldn't be that complicated. It should be pretty clear. But again, what was confusing is there's the original rules, there's the revised rules, and then there are the cards, and they're all kind of different and mixed. They give you mixed messages about what you should be doing. So yeah, look, bringing this all together, as I said, really fascinating game, a lot of tension, a lot of back and forth, it felt much more fighting than Paths of Glory, more important. It felt like every battle we're engaged in was critical, and every dice roll was tense and sort of angst-inducing. Blended with those really fascinating historical events, you really feel that the Russians are struggling with their kind of war machine and material shortages and troop shortages and internal crises. And the Germans are this juggernaut. They have these big, powerful, elite armies. Most of what you can see here are reserves, but you've got the standard armies here in the white. You've got elite armies as well. But then you've got the Austro-Hungarians, who are this like old empire on the verge of crumbling, and they're on the verge of collapse because they've got, they're fighting a war in Italy. They're fighting against these Russians and their forts on the frontier. Then they're fighting, when Romania enters war, suddenly they've got to deal with Romania and Greece, and then the French and the British are coming up from the south. And, it's the Austrians are in this area because they've been attacking Serbia, so they have to deal with that. And so the Austrians feel like they're really under the pump, under pressure everywhere. And the Germans, you can see I had Germans on the Italian front. I've got Germans down here in Greece. I did have Germans around here in Serbia, Albania helping out. I've got Germans in Budapest. I've got a stack here. So the fact that I have a stack here kind of tells you that I was in a comfortable position, right? Then I've got Germans in Romania and Germans pushing into sort of southern Russia. This unit was up here. He's pulled back. So the Germans really have to help Austria-Hungary. I felt, at least my experiences was, the Germans really had to step up and be that balance for the Central Powers, intervene where needed. They are the ones who, with their superior troops and superior reinforcements, replacements. So whenever you play a replacement card, you get more German than you do Austrian or Central Powers allies. Okay, so the Germans need to be soaking off Russian strength. What I mean by that is, if the Austrians have been attacked by the Russians, right, they'll need their replacements. So the Germans need to then attack the Russians to reduce them and force them to kind of like be on roughly a replacement parity with the Austrians. If the Germans aren't helping the Austrians, then the Austrians are going to be in a lot of trouble. Not only through attacking in the north, but they actually were sending a lot of troops down here in the south. Now, you may look at these Russian stacks and you may think, wow, there are so many Russians. Why are they struggling? A couple of reasons. Russian units are weaker. So if I can just compare these two armies, this is the German 10th Corps and the Russian 21st Corps. You can see the Germans are 33% stronger, 4-3. They also have a 50% higher loss factor, 3-2. Basically what that means is that in any given battle, the Germans are going to be roughly, on average, 33% stronger. If I can just compare what I've got here, I've got a strength of 9 versus a Russian strength of 7. They've got a cavalry there, but they're about 33% stronger. When they take losses, if the Germans take, let's say, a loss factor of 5, they flip one unit, they can't resolve the other two. They say they've only taken 3 loss factors. If the Russians take 5, they're kind of really going to be reduced. Then they have to remove that So whilst the Russians look like they've got a lot of armies, they are considerably weaker, both in terms of strength and their ability to absorb losses. So the Russians have to play carefully. They have to choose their battles carefully. Throughout the game, the Russians were really trying to focus not on fighting the Germans, but on defending against the Germans and trying to put most of their pressure on the Austrians down here. And the Germans were countering this by supporting. You can see here, it was the Germans who were pushing against these Russian forts on the frontier. This is the area that you'd expect the Austrians to push north, the Galician campaign, but it was actually the Germans who eventually pushed from the west through modern-day Poland and so forth. Some really fascinating tension there between the two. So look, that's about it. This is I do recommend this game. I am fascinated by it. I want to play it again. I want to explore it more. But my goodness, it is the most, I'm trying to find the words, it is the most unpolished GMT game I've ever bought. And that was a huge disappointment. 2017 publication, so, it's 8 years old now, but even at 2017, GMT was setting a standard. And this is it's an exception. I don't know how they managed to kind of get these kind of errors creeping through production. I don't know why. And I'm trying to find sort of two counters, but the size of the counters are different. So when you stack some counters together, what it looks like is something like that. You've got a 1 to 2 millimeter difference in the height of what should be identical counters, and missing counters. Just things. Reminder tokens like. Well, I don't know where. I haven't checked the sheet, but this is our Serbian collapse, stuff like that. So, if you've got a first edition copy and you're prepared to print off the living rules and make those modifications, I recommend you do. Otherwise, get a more revised version from GMT. Get the living rules, because there really is a wonderful game design. Perry's done a great job. In designing this. It's fascinating. It is sort of true to the feel of Paths of Glory and Pursuit of Glory, and it's below those barriers. It's a wonderful, tense, exciting experience that is, as I said, really kind of true to the history of the Great War on the Eastern Front. All right, folks, thanks for watching. Hope this has been informative, and take care. Thanks, everyone.